Paul has established his thesis in the first chapter. The just shall live by faith. That is, the just are made righteous by faith. Then he goes on to argue all humanity under sin, none righteous. He concludes all under sin. And naturally, when he concludes all under sin, this raised a major issue with the seed of Abraham, the Jewish people, God's chosen people. Because when Paul says things as he did in the conclusion of chapter 2, he says in verse 28, "For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God." Now, God called the Jews. God commanded circumcision. Now, Paul is arguing that real Jews are not Jews externally. It seems as if he is denying the value of being Jewish or of circumcision. So Paul raises the question, the interrogative in the 3rd chapter. So then, what advantage is it of being Jewish? And what profit is there of circumcision? He's quick to answer in verse 2 of chapter 3, much in every way, because the supreme value, other than through whom the Messiah came, of the Jewish people is that they were the recipients. They were the beneficiaries, for lack of a better word, of the very oracles of God. That word oracles there is a word that means sacred writings, important sayings. It's the Greek word that's an abbreviated form of the word logos, so that the Jews receive the very word of God. Now, we're Gentiles. We're African Americans. We're not Jewish, but this book we received from the Jews. So they were, but the word of God, they received it, but they also were to transmit it, to give it out. But a problem arises. Here's the problem. The problem is, it's become evident that God made certain promises to the seed of Abraham. He promised them they would be blessed. He promised them they would receive the promise. God put a blessing on Abraham in perpetuity. But the problem is, not all of the seed of Abraham received the promise. Stay with me now. God said, you'll all get the promise, but all didn't get it. So that raises a question that why didn't they get it? So Paul argues that are we in this vortex, this crisis, to where their unbelief nullified the promises of God? For you see, yes, the promises were made to the physical seed of Abraham, but the promise only rested to those who accepted it by faith. So being physically a seed of Abraham wasn't enough. It was unbelief that broke them off. You got to get this now. They were promised God's blessing, but didn't get it because of unbelief. But Paul argued, don't let that fool you. Their unbelief didn't cancel God's promise. Do you remember there was a group of them in the wilderness who got to Kadesh Barnea? They were the seed of Abraham. The promise was theirs, but when they moved into unbelief, God cut them off and made them wander in the wilderness until a whole generation of those that did believe were able to receive the promise. Let me tell you as I close this morning, you've got to understand something. Belief is an interesting word. Quite frankly, if I can just make it where you can get it this morning, believe really means to agree with God. Now I'm going to preach this again because there's something in here I can't touch on today, but man's fundamental problem is man is in a disagreement with God. Now you can talk about all kind of sin you want, but man's ultimate philosophical, theological, anthropological, sociological, economic problem is God says one thing and we're saying something else. But let God be true and every man a liar. Good religion simply means you agree with God. If you look at chapter 3 in verse 4, when actually Paul here is quoting David. For when David committed his great sin, he says, Lord, I'm saying this, watch this, so you'll be justified when you speak. Now let me just say, what David was really saying was, Lord, you are right and I am wrong. Let me tell you what it means to have good religion. It means to agree with God. And this morning, church, I'm calling you to agree with God. Good religion is when you say what God says even when you don't feel it. You say what God says even when it doesn't look like it. I don't care what people say. Let God be true. If God said it, it is true. If God says I'm healed, I agree with God. If God says I'm forgiven, I agree with God. Faith is agreeing with God. Faith is lining yourself up. Faith doesn't mean you do everything right, but as long as I'm lined up with God. That word confess is an interesting Greek word. It's homologeo. Homo means the same, like unto, alike, another. Legeo means word. So when you confess something, you say what somebody else is saying. And the way to have good religion, you can't say what I say. You can't say what mom and daddy say. But when you say what God said, and say it even when the whole world is against you, say it when you don't feel it, say it when it's not feeling right, say it when it doesn't make sense. I stand with God this morning. God says I'm blessed and I'm blessed. God says I'm coming out and I'm coming out. God says I'm healed and I'm healed. God said I'm forgiven and I am forgiven. I agree with God. Let God be true and every man a liar. God is my help. God is my strength. God is my peace. God is my joy. The doors of the church are open.